In this video, I'm talking about John Hardwig's paper, Epistemic Dependence. In this paper, he argues for three main claims. First, he argues that sometimes it is justified for someone to believe something even if they don't have evidence for it. Second, he argues that sometimes rationality consists in refusing to think for yourself. Third, he argues that these points should lead us to a reconceptualization of what we think of as knowledge. Perhaps sometimes knowledge can be had without any understanding, or perhaps knowledge is something that a community has rather than an individual. Some of this seems to go against everything that you might have been taught in a liberal education. Believing things without evidence, refusing to think for yourself. But perhaps some of this might become a bit more plausible once we turn to his terminology. And one of the important points in this paper is going to be that Hardwig distinguishes good reason to believe something from evidence. Evidence is the sort of thing which needs to be had somewhere by someone in order for a community to have good reason to believe. And on his terminology, the mere fact that someone claims that something is true could never count as evidence in his sense. But the fact that someone claims something is true could provide me with good reason to believe, even though it wouldn't be evidence. So he's going to say, often we should believe things because of the claims of other people, even though we lack the evidence ourselves. And in terms of the refusal to think for oneself, I think this point has probably become a lot clearer to a lot of people in the past couple of years. At the time I'm recording this video, much of the public discussion in the past couple of years has consisted of people thinking for themselves and getting themselves into all sorts of trouble because they're thinking for themselves about vaccines or election results or epidemiology or race and gender has led themselves into all sorts of problems. Hardwig's main point in this second section is going to be, if there really are good experts on something available, then insisting on thinking for yourself rather than deferring to the expert will often constitute some sort of irrationality. All of this is going to leave us with the question, if believing things without evidence is so good, and if thinking for yourself is so bad, then why does our education system emphasize looking for evidence, trying to get it yourself, and trying to think for yourself so much? The idea that I think Hardwig is suggesting is that it's important to learn to insist that there be evidence, whether or not you actually yourself have it. And it's also important to try thinking for yourself. And both of these are going to be because, on the one hand, there's a chance that you might someday be one of the experts on whatever the topic is. And the other point is that by working through these things in your education, you're going to get some sense of what is involved in expertise so that you might get better at identifying experts to defer to. But we can see. Okay, so let's jump in. Epistemic dependence. I find myself believing all sorts of things for which I do not possess evidence. That smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. That my car keeps stalling because the carburetor needs to be rebuilt. That mass media threatens democracy. In 1985, that seems ahead of its time. That slums cause emotional disorders. That my irregular heartbeat is premature ventricular contraction. That students' grades are not correlated with success in the non-academic world. That nuclear power plants are not safe enough. The list of things that I believe, though I have no evidence for the truth of them, is, if not infinite, virtually endless. And I am finite. Though I can readily imagine what I would have to do to obtain the evidence that would support any one of my beliefs, I cannot imagine being able to do this for all of my beliefs. I believe too much. There is too much relevant evidence, much of it available only after extensive specialized training. Intellect is too small and life is too short. What are we as epistemologists to say about all these beliefs? If I, without the available evidence, nevertheless believe a proposition, are my belief and I in that belief necessarily irrational or non-rational? Is my belief then mere belief, Plato's right opinion? Here he's referring to the idea that in one of the dialogues, Plato is interested in the question, what is knowledge? And he comes along the way to the conclusion that knowledge is not merely believing something and having it be right. It at least requires having something more to tie your belief to the truth. And you might think of that in terms of possession of evidence. But he's saying if possession of the evidence isn't relevant, then do we just have true belief? If not, why not? Are there other good reasons for believing propositions? Reasons which do not reduce to having evidence for the truth of the propositions. What would these reasons look like? In this paper, I want to consider the idea of intellectual authority, particularly that of experts. I want to explore the logic or epistemic structure of an appeal to intellectual authority and the way in which such an appeal constitutes justification for believing and knowing. I have divided the paper into 3 parts. In the first, I argue that one can have good reasons for believing a proposition if one has good reasons to believe that others have good reasons to believe it, and that consequently, there's a kind of good reason for believing which does not constitute evidence for the truth of the proposition. In the second, I urge that because the layman is the epistemic inferior of the expert in matters in which the expert is expert, rationality sometimes consists in refusing to think for oneself. In the third, I apply the results of these considerations to the concept of knowledge and argue that the expert-layman relationship is essential to the scientific and scholarly pursuit of knowledge. If I'm correct, appeals to epistemic authority are essentially ingredient in much of our knowledge. Appeals to the authority of experts often provide justification for claims to know, as well as grounding rational belief. At the same time, however, the epistemic superiority of the expert to the layman implies rational authority over the layman, undermining the intellectual autonomy of the individual and forcing a re-examination of our notion of rationality. The epistemic individualism implicit in many of our epistemologies is thus called into question, with important implications for how we understand knowledge and the knower, as well as for our conception of rationality. Okay, section 1. Restricting ourselves here and throughout the paper to belief in and knowledge of propositions for which there is evidence, let us suppose that there are good reasons to believe a proposition, that P. So P is going to be the proposition believed. What kinds of things can be good reasons to believe that P? The usual answer to this question is in terms of evidence. Evidence being defined roughly as anything that counts toward establishing the truth of P. That is, sound arguments, as well as factual information. There is evidence then for the truth of P, but it does not follow that everyone has or even can have this evidence. Suppose that person A has good reasons, evidence for believing that P, but a second person, B, does not. In this sense, B has no reasons or insufficient reasons to believe that P. However, suppose also that B has good reasons to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P. Does B then, ipso facto, have good reasons to believe that P? If so, B's belief is epistemically grounded in an appeal to the authority of A and A's belief. And if we accept this, we will be able to explain how B's belief can be more than mere belief, how it can, indeed, be rational belief, and how B can be rational in his belief that P. And our problems will be solved, or only starting. Only starting because we are then faced with the prospect, not formerly considered by epistemologists, of a very odd kind of good reason for belief, a reason that does not constitute evidence for the truth of P. For B's reasons for believing that P are not evidence for the truth of P. Here he's going to give his argument that helps us understand what his definition of evidence and good reason for belief are and how they differ. We can see this by noting 2 things. 1, although A's evidence, that is the person who actually has the original evidence, counts toward establishing the truth of P, the case for P is not stronger after B discovers that A has this evidence than it was before B found out about A and A's reasons. I think he's imagining here some sort of case for something. Like, imagine that you're in court and one witness, A, has already given you some evidence. And then now another witness learns that A has the evidence. In court, we wouldn't count the second witness learning that the first person has evidence as any more evidence. It's only the first person's evidence that counts towards establishing the truth. 2, the chain of appeals to authority must end somewhere. And if the whole chain of appeals is to be epistemically sound, it must end with someone who possesses the necessary evidence, since truth claims cannot be established by an appeal to authority, nor by investigating what other people believe about them. And now here, I think he's again thinking of established in terms of, in a social sense. Someone has to have the original knowledge. It's not enough if all of us believe that someone else has the original evidence. Now his footnote. Here is where he's going to discuss the terminological issue. It might still seem that if B has good reasons to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P, then B has evidence that P. The dispute between me and someone inclined to press this objection would turn on delicate epistemological issues involved in clarifying the concept of evidence. But I would argue that B does not have evidence that P, urging, in addition to the arguments presented in the body of this paper, the following. 1, evidence that P counts against evidence that not P. But consider a case of conflicting experts. A, who has evidence that P, and C, who has evidence that not P. So this sort of thing happens all the time. We know that there's lots of evidence out there for things, and some person might have evidence for one hypothesis, someone else might have evidence against that hypothesis, because the evidence is never purely clean cut. There's often evidence in multiple directions, so one person could have evidence for and another person could have evidence against. Now, in such a case, if B believes that P only because he believes that A has good reasons to believe that P, B's reasons do not count against C's, only A's do. So that is, here's his argument. If we've got 3 people, one of them with evidence for, one of them with evidence against, and one of them who's heard the first person's evidence for, we only have 2 pieces of evidence that maybe cancel out. The fact that another person has heard of someone's evidence doesn't count against the third person's evidence. And so if this is right, so here's his assumption, this is right. If this is right, then hearing that someone else has evidence cannot count as evidence itself, even though it might be perfectly good reason to believe. 2, it would be possible to construct cases in which B has good reason to believe that A has good reason to believe that P, even where we would agree that there is no evidence. More on such cases in section 2 below. And I think the idea here is going to be, maybe I think someone has good evidence for something, and I have good reason to believe that they do, but I was wrong. Good reason to believe doesn't guarantee that it's true. Maybe no one has any evidence for this, but I believe someone else does, and I had good reason to believe. Then no one has evidence, so therefore my good reason to believe must not have been evidence. But regardless of how this dispute about the term evidence is to be resolved, I would observe that B's reasons are logically dependent on A's. Most of the rest of the points in this paper will follow if this is granted. Okay, back to the main text. But B must have some good reasons to support his belief that P, or else that belief would be mere belief, Plato's right opinion again. B does have good reasons, all right. In fact, he has evidence, but his evidence doesn't count towards establishing the truth of P itself. It only counts towards establishing that A, unlike B himself, knows what he's talking about when he says that P. How can B have good reasons to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P when B does not himself have evidence that P? Well, it's easy. B has good reasons to believe that A has conducted the inquiry necessary to have evidence for believing that P. So if I have evidence about what someone else has done, and my evidence tells me that they've done an investigation that gives them evidence about P, then I have good reason to believe that P, even if I do not have the evidence for P myself. If the necessary inquiry is simple enough, B's belief that P can be grounded in A's, despite the fact that we would not call A an expert. For example, if the service station attendant who checks my oil informs me that it's okay, I would believe him, but I would not call him an expert. I'm not sure if we'd all agree. I might call the service station attendant an expert. I mean, they're certainly an expert compared to me in terms of dealing with cars, but there certainly are cases where you don't need to be an expert. If I'm looking outside and I tell you that it's raining and you trust me, then your good reason to believe that I have good reason to believe doesn't require me to be any sort of expert. It doesn't take an expert to recognize that it's raining. It just takes someone who's looking outside. However, the more epistemologically interesting cases are those in which expertise is involved. Cases in which B has good reason to believe that A is an expert about whether or not P, in consequence of inquiry that has been sustained, prolonged, and systematic. Second footnote. I assume that we can all agree that there are experts, but I have not attempted in this paper to offer a precise definition of expert or to delineate the range of possible expertise beyond the introductory proviso that this paper is restricted to belief in and knowledge of propositions for which there is evidence. I think his point about propositions for which there is evidence is meant to rule out faith-based beliefs that we might think are justified, but in a very different way. So he's thinking about the sorts of beliefs that are ultimately justified on some level by an appeal to evidence. And some people might say this is all the sorts of beliefs that there are, but even if you disagree, we can just consider those and say, some people might be experts in some of these cases. He's not going to tell us exactly what's involved in being an expert. But if the theses of this paper are correct, however, it will become crucial for epistemologists to argue about the definition of expert and the range of actual and possible expertise. For instance, is it possible for someone to be an expert on moral issues, to be an expert on aesthetic issues, to be an expert on who knows what sort of thing? There's all sorts of beliefs out there. And if the existence of experts is relevant to whether or not the rest of us are justified in believing things, then maybe it matters which topics have experts. But one observation about my use of expert is in order. It does not presuppose or entail the truth of the expert's views. That is, an expert can be mistaken. There are many experts out there on the dinosaurs, and those experts disagree about a lot of specifics about how did various dinosaurs emerge, die, what did they do, and so on. And the fact that those experts can disagree while still remaining experts indicates that not every belief held by an expert in their subject matter is true. At least some of them are false. And yet, they might still be an expert. If one defines expert in terms of the truth of his views, as Plato's Gorgias and Thrasymachus do, it is often impossible in principle to say who is an expert, even if one is an expert oneself, since it is often impossible to say whose view is coincident with the truth. So that is, he's saying, someone might want to define an expert as someone who not only has lots of study, but also has the true beliefs. And he says, if you define expert that way, then the people we ordinarily call experts about a subject matter would disagree about who the experts are, and it would be impossible to tell who was right unless we ourselves figured out the truth of the subject matter. And he wants a definition of expert where it's possible to tell who's an expert, even if we haven't confirmed which ones of them have true beliefs. But I submit that it is not similarly impossible to say that what constitutes sustained, relevant inquiry and to ascertain who is engaged in it, though there will sometimes be very real problems in making this judgment. Figuring out who is actually an expert in epidemiology or virology has been very difficult in the past couple of years because not every person with a medical degree is an expert in viruses or epidemics. And some of us can't tell the difference between experts in one area and experts in another. But some people can tell that difference, and there is a difference, and it is tellable without having to first figure out the truth of every question for ourselves. Whenever sustained inquiry is both necessary for and efficacious with respect to determining whether or not P, the expert's views are less likely to be mistaken and also likely to be less mistaken than an inexpert opinion. Thus, in my use of expert, the connection between truth and the views of the expert is not completely severed, though that connection is neither necessary nor simple. That is, he's saying, what it is to be an expert is something like to have engaged in a long period of study of the sort that is likely to lead to the truth, but does not guarantee getting the truth. Okay, so back to the main text. The layman's appeal to the intellectual authority of the expert, his epistemic dependence on the expert, and his intellectual inferiority to the expert in matters on which the expert is expert, are all expressed by the formula with which we have been working. B has good reason to believe that A has good reason to believe that P. But the layman's epistemic inferiority and dependence can be even more radical. In many cases, extensive training and special competence may be necessary before B could conduct the necessary inquiry. And lacking this training and competence, B may not be able to understand A's reasons. Or even if he does understand them, he may not be able to appreciate why they are good reasons. Michael Polanyi and Harry Prosch put the first part of this point dramatically, taking their examples from the physical sciences. The popular conception of science says that science is a collection of observable facts that anybody can verify for himself. We have seen that this is not true in the case of expert knowledge, like that needed in diagnosing a disease. Moreover, it is not true in the physical sciences. In the first place, for instance, a layman cannot possibly get hold of the equipment for testing a statement of fact in astronomy or in chemistry. Even supposing that he could somehow get the use of an observatory or a chemical laboratory, he would not know how to use the instruments he found there, and might very well damage them beyond repair before he had ever made a single observation. And even if he should succeed in carrying out an observation to check up on a statement of science and found a result that contradicted it, he could rightly assume that he had made a mistake, as students do in a laboratory when they are learning to use its equipment. That is, the important thing to note here is just having the equipment and hitting the buttons on it doesn't guarantee that you get the right answer. There's all sorts of background that you have to learn about how to make this equipment work. I mean, think about your computer or your phone or your car. There's likely some feature of it that's just weird that you've learned how to make it work, that someone else picking up your device would be confused. Why is it doing this thing? And you say, oh yeah, you just have to reboot that and it'll avoid that problem. And lab scientists deal with this sort of stuff a millionfold because they're dealing with really complicated and really detailed aspects of the world. And you have to develop all sorts of knacks and know-hows in order to use the equipment right, to even get a single experiment done in a way that yields a single data point. And then learning how to come up with more data points, statistically analyze them, and figure out which ones would be relevant to the theory in question. All of that is going to be beyond most people's abilities. Moreover, the training and resultant competence to conduct the required inquiry are often accessible only to those with certain talents and abilities. Consequently, B might not ever be able to obtain the evidence that supports his belief that P. If my own desperate and losing struggle with freshman calculus is a reliable indicator, I might never be able to obtain the evidence for my belief that relativity physics is correct, no matter how much time and effort I devoted to the enterprise. I may simply lack the mathematical ability to possess that evidence. This is a point that I disagree with Hardwig on. I don't think that anyone completely lacks the ability to develop this sort of mathematical competence. I think most of the time it's the result of an education system that hasn't made it interesting enough for someone to put in the effort that they would need to develop that ability. But still, even if people could develop that ability, most people don't develop that ability. And in many cases, it might take much more time and energy than they have available to do so, even if they could in principle. But extensive training and special competence may be necessary before one can assess or even understand the expert's reasons for believing that P. Although I might be able to understand studies about the impact of mass media on voters, I am not competent to assess the merits of those studies, unversed as I am in the issues surrounding social science research methods. You read studies all the time about this sort of stuff. Some of them are probably designed well, some of them are probably designed badly and just get a lot of media attention. And there's something ironic in that studies about the bad influence of media often are done badly and yet spread by the media anyway. And lacking the requisite mathematical training and ability, I cannot even read the books and articles that support my belief that relativity physics is correct. If, then, layman B, 1, has not performed the inquiry that would provide the evidence for his belief that P, 2, is not competent and perhaps could not even become competent to perform that inquiry, 3, is not able to assess the merits of the evidence provided by expert A's inquiry, and 4, may not even be able to understand the evidence and how it supports A's belief that P. Can B nonetheless have good reasons to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P? I think he can. If so, should we conclude that B's belief that P is rationally justified? I think we should, acknowledging that B's belief stands on better epistemic ground than other beliefs which we would call simply irrational or non-rational. Many epistemologists may be tempted to reject this conclusion because it is so divergent from our received view about the nature of rational belief. But I think we must say that B's belief is rationally justified, even if he does not know or understand what A's reasons are. If we do not wish to be forced to conclude that a very large percentage of beliefs in any complex culture are simply and unavoidably rational or non-rational. For in such cultures, more is known that is relevant to the truth of one's belief than anyone could know by himself. And surely it would be paradoxical for epistemologists to maintain that the more that is known in a culture, the less rational the beliefs of individuals in that culture. So think about that for a moment. Imagine that we went back in time, maybe 8,000 years, to subsistence farmers living in the Fertile Crescent. There, an individual household may in fact have all the knowledge about how their agriculture works that anyone does. And so maybe they are going to be justified in terms of having the evidence for most of their beliefs about the world. That is, apart from the beliefs that are based entirely on faith or whatever else that isn't based on evidence. But think about us now in the modern world. I believe all sorts of things about global warming, about the validity of the COVID test that I just took, about the way that the US government works and how it would react to certain kinds of situations that haven't come up in my life. I have all sorts of beliefs about complex systems that I have never studied myself. I believe that a parachute will help you if you jump out of a plane. I believe that many of the planets and moons in our solar system have liquid water on them. But I myself don't have any of the evidence for these things. I don't even know how to go about getting the evidence for these things. I believe that certain brands of cell phone have higher speeds than certain other brands of cell phone, and that they're going to be better at doing the kinds of things that I want to do with a phone, even if I myself haven't tested all those phones. There's all sorts of things that we have beliefs for, that we rely on experts for, that we may not even be able to check the experts for. And so he says, if we want to count our ordinary daily beliefs in the modern world as being rational, then we have to allow for a notion of rationality that allows for beliefs where I lack the evidence. Okay, section 2. Nevertheless, acceptance of epistemological individualism dies hard. It may well resurface in the guise of a suggestion about the appropriate stance of a responsible and rational layman in relation to the expert. If I am not presently in a position to know what the expert's good reasons for believing that P are, or to understand why these are good reasons, I'm obviously in no position to check the accuracy of what he tells me. What stance should I then take? A plausible and tempting suggestion is that if I think I have the required ability, I should become informed so that I can assess the reliability of the expert's reports and thus escape my dependence on him and regain my intellectual autonomy. The idea behind this suggestion lies at the heart of one model of what it means to be an intellectually responsible and rational person, a model which is nicely captured by Kant's statement that one of the three basic rules or maxims for avoiding error in thinking is to think for oneself, to dare to know. This is, I think, an extremely pervasive model of rationality. It underlies Descartes' methodological doubt. It is implicit in most epistemologies. It colors the way we think about knowledge. On this view, the very core of rationality consists in preserving and adhering to one's own independent judgment. For how can one be sure one is being informed rather than misinformed if one suspends judgment? But I submit that this model provides us with a romantic ideal which is thoroughly unrealistic and which in practice results in less rational belief in judgment. I could indeed escape epistemic dependence on some experts. Perhaps if I'm talented enough, I could escape reliance on any given expert. I can and do choose where to establish my intellectual autonomy. There are some things that I have put in the work to figure out for myself how it works and not just trust other people. But if I were to pursue epistemic autonomy across the board, I would succeed only in holding relatively uninformed, unreliable, crude, untested, and therefore irrational beliefs. If I would be rational, I can never avoid some epistemic dependence on experts, owing to the fact that I believe more than I can become fully informed about. Once more then, if I am not in a position to know what the expert's good reasons for believing the P are and why these are good reasons, what stance should I take in relation to the expert? If I do not know these things, I'm also in no position to determine whether the person really is an expert. By asking the right questions, I might be able to spot a few quacks, phonies, or incompetents, but only the more obvious ones. For example, I may suspect that my doctor is incompetent, but generally, I would have to know what doctors know in order to confirm or dispel my suspicion. Thus, we must face the implications of the fact that laymen do not fully understand what constitutes good reasons in the domain of expert opinion. Granted, I can check on a given expert and perhaps obtain a ranking of various experts by relying on other experts. If my doctor says that I should see a cardiologist, I can ask him and other physicians in the community about the local cardiologists. Or, if I want to know the effects of mass media on voters, I can go to the political science department and ask who has done the best work in this area, and is there any significant criticism of it? This checking and ranking of experts can be expressed by extending our formula and its implied chain of authority. B has good reasons for believing that C has good reasons for believing that A has good reasons for believing that P. That is, I might have good reasons to believe that my doctor has good reason to believe that this cardiologist has good reasons to believe things about my heart. My doctor may not know what's going on with my heart, but he might be in a position to tell me who the right cardiologists to ask are. And in some cases, we might even go farther than this, that maybe I have to ask my friend who reads up about sports, who are the experts on some sort of sport, that they would then be able to tell me who are the experts on one particular team or one particular player or one particular methodology, who would then have the knowledge about the particular thing that I'm interested in. So I might need a longer chain of authority here, that you need experts to even figure out who the experts are. However, by appealing to such a hierarchy of experts, I have not regained my epistemic autonomy by avoiding reliance on experts. I've only extended and refined this reliance. Nor could I regain my epistemic autonomy in all cases without believing on the basis of relatively crude and untested reasons. Imagine if all of us had to figure out the shape of the Earth for ourselves. What would we even do? Do you even know how people establish that the Earth is round? I mean, there are some ways that I maybe have done. Maybe I've been on planes that go around the world. But again, I'm relying on the testimony of the pilot that this really did go around the world. How am I supposed to know that? Could I even tell if the plane was gradually going in a big circle? And maybe I've seen some things that indicate the curvature of the Earth from space, but flat earthers know all sorts of problems with all these sorts of evidence that ordinary people are likely to come up with. You have to go to real experts on the shape of the Earth, and there's far fewer of those than you think. Granted also, if I do not know and have no way of finding out who the experts are, I will have no way to appeal to the chain of authority. I will not then know who has good reasons to believe that P, to whom to defer, or whose opinion, if any, will give me good reasons for believing that P. There are some subjects that maybe there aren't any good experts on. He's talking a lot about the effect of media on voters. I suspect that at least some of that research is much more difficult than people in the 1980s thought, and maybe a lot of what they thought they were doing may not have turned out to be real expert inquiry. This sometimes happens, and when it does, rational deference becomes impossible. But generally, I can find someone whose opinion is more informed than mine, and who can refer me to someone who is knowledgeable about whether or not P. And even if a layman, because of his relative inability to discriminate among experts, ends up appealing to a lesser instead of a greater expert, the lesser expert's opinion will still be better than the layman's. Of course, a more detailed account of the whole issue of identifying relevant experts would have to distinguish among 1, B merely believing that A has good reasons to believe that P, 2, B having some reason to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P, and 3, B having good reasons to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P. That is, I might believe that someone's an expert without them actually being an expert. I might have some reason to believe they're an expert without actually having good reason to believe they're an expert. It's only in the case where I have good reason to believe that they're an expert that trusting them gives me a good reason to believe. None of this resolves the often excruciating practical problem of identifying who the real or best experts are. E.g., what is the patient faced with conflicting medical opinions to do? If one doctor says do this and another doctor says do that, which do you do? And all of us have been through this a lot in the past couple of years. Many medical authorities have said all sorts of conflicting things about whether or not masks are helpful in preventing respiratory disease, under what circumstances, how good do the masks have to be, how effective are they, and a million other things. There's conflicting opinions out there, and some of them are better informed than others, but even among the experts, there is some disagreement on all these issues because they're hard issues to figure out. But these are logically posterior issues and problems. The argument of this section of the paper is that in any case, you should not make your own diagnosis, nor even read up some about your problem and then make your own diagnosis. You should try to figure out who the experts are and let them diagnose you. In terms of our formula then, B could believe that P either because B has good reason to believe that A has good reason to believe that P, or because B has good reason to believe that C has good reason to believe that A has good reason to believe that P. But in either case, B cannot have sufficiently good reason not to believe that P, or to believe that not P. In other words, the layman cannot rationally refuse to defer to the views of the expert or experts he acknowledges. This does not mean that B can never successfully raise a devastating objection to believing that P, or imagine an alternative to believing that P. But it does mean that only someone with A's expertise can make an accurate assessment of the value and validity of the objection or alternative. There's various objections I can come up with for lots of medical claims, for lots of claims about the shape of the Earth. Are the objections I'm coming up with any good? Most of them are probably just based on some sort of misunderstanding, and I'm just not getting it. And I'd need to talk to an expert who can explain to me why it's a misunderstanding. Or maybe the expert can't even explain to me why it's a misunderstanding. Maybe you have to take 2 years of medical school biology or grad school physics to understand why that particular conjecture doesn't actually cause the problems that I thought it did. We need the expert to figure out whether or not our own objections are any good. Under cross-examination by the layman, the expert may admit the cogency of a given point, but the expert and his fellow experts must judge whether it is cogent and germane, since they are the only ones who fully understand what is involved in the methods, techniques, premises, and bases of the expert's training and inquiry, and how these affect the resultant belief. The layman can, in other words, propose criticisms and alternatives, but rationally, he must allow the expert to dispose of them. For in a conversation with an expert, as opposed to a dialogue among equals, the final court of rational appeal belongs solely to one party, by virtue of that party's greater competence for and commitment to inquiry into the relevant subject matter. The rational layman recognizes that his own judgment, uninformed by training and inquiry as it is rationally inferior to that of the expert and the community of experts for whom the expert usually speaks. Even experts are not experts in every aspect of their subject matter. Much of it they just know by trusting the other experts in their field. A climate scientist who studies ice cores in Greenland may not have all the details about atmospheric chemistry or the turning of the sea temperature cycles or any of the other things that go into discussing climate change. But they might be much more exposed to the information there and know who the relevant experts on those things are. And the rational layman recognizes that his own judgment, uninformed by training and inquiry as it is rationally inferior to that of the expert and the community of experts for whom the expert usually speaks, and consequently can always be rationally overruled. Recognizing that the highest court of rational appeal lies outside of himself, the layman may simply have to accept the fact that his objection is not a good one, even though it still seems good to him. There are, of course, a whole series of ad hominems that permit a layman rationally to refuse to defer to the expert's opinion. Think about this. We often hear about ad hominem in the context of logical reasoning, where ad hominem arguments are, logically speaking, a fallacy. But even though they're a logical fallacy, they may be the one thing that epistemologically we are in a position to use against experts. The layman can assert that the expert is not a disinterested neutral witness, that his interest in the outcome of the discussion prejudices his testimony. There might be some people who claim that a given type of biological research or nuclear research is totally safe, but they are experts on this and claim that it's safe, maybe because they want to keep doing it. And maybe they're not just disinterested and observing that it's safe. They have a good time in their research field. They want it to keep going. They don't want their kind of research to be banned. And so maybe we shouldn't necessarily trust them if they say their research is safe. But if someone else says this, then we don't have that ad hominem. Of course, the fact that we have this ad hominem does not show that the reasoning they're giving is unsound. For that, you need to have the expertise. And that's where the logical fallacy comes in. Just pointing out that someone is not a disinterested third party is not a good argument that their views are incorrect. Just, it might be a good argument that we shouldn't trust it without understanding it ourselves. The layman can assert that the expert is not a disinterested neutral witness, that his interest in the outcome of the discussion prejudices testimony, or that he is not operating in good faith, that he's lying, for example, or refusing to acknowledge a mistake in his views, because to do so would tend to undermine his claim to special competence, or that he's covering for his peers, or knuckling under to social pressure from others in his field, etc., etc. Such ad hominems are not always fallacious, and they sometimes do ground the rational refusal to defer to the statements of experts. But one interesting feature of such ad hominems is that they seem, and perhaps are, much more admissible, important, and damning in a layman's discussions with experts than they are in dialogues among peers. It doesn't matter so much if one's peers are biased or operating in bad faith, they will be found out. The merits of their argument can be tested and evaluated rather than just accepted. So that is, if we're a community of experts debating something, in that context, you don't make ad hominem arguments. In that context, you address the arguments themselves. But if you're a layman, then ad hominems might give you a reason not to trust the expert, but they cannot refute the expert's argument. And what we might say is that they form an undercutting defeater. They give us reason not to trust this argument rather than a rebutting defeater, an argument that the argument is wrong. The experts get the rebutting defeaters. We just get undercutting. With the exception, often an important exception, of such ad hominems, I see no way to avoid the conclusion I've proposed above, that the rational layman will recognize that in matters about which there is good reason to believe that there is expert opinion, he ought methodologically not to make up his own mind. His stance on these matters will, if he is rational, usually be rational deference to the epistemic authority of the expert. If it is objected that in cases of divided expert opinion, the layman will have no method for deciding whether or not to believe the P, this is granted. Footnote, if it's possible to rank experts in the ways that Lehrer has explored or in some other way, the layman can, of course, resolve the dilemma posed by divided expert opinion by deferring to the best expert opinion. However, there will still be cases in which even the best experts will disagree. But in such cases, the cases of divided opinion, the rational layman, recognizing that his own relatively casual and crude inquiry is not competent to resolve issues that even the sustained inquiry of experts cannot resolve, will also recognize that he is confronted with a situation in which he must either suspend belief or, if this is impossible or undesirable, arrive at belief on some admittedly non-rational basis. And if it is objected that layman B can have good reasons to believe that P, even when P is false, and even when expert A does not have good reasons to believe that P, this is also granted. For B will sometimes be misled by phony or mistaken claims to expertise, despite a careful attempt to ascertain that A is indeed an expert about P. And moreover, there is simply no guarantee that the views of even the best present experts are coincident with the final truth. The conclusion that it is sometimes irrational to think for oneself, that rationality sometimes consists in deferring to epistemic authority, and consequently in passively and uncritically accepting what we are given to believe, will strike those wedded to epistemic individualism as odd and unacceptable, for it undermines their paradigm of rationality. To others, it might seem too obvious for such belaboring, but in either case, I submit, we should recast our epistemologies and our accounts of rationality to make them congruent with this important fact of modern life. Okay, section 3. Although the preceding discussion is obviously relevant to the big word of epistemology, know, I have so far astutely avoided using it. But the relevance of the discussion is clear, given the standard analysis of A knows that P in terms of 1, A believes that P, 2, A has good reasons to believe that P, and 3, that P is true. The third condition, that P is true, is standardly taken to be the kicker, and it threatens to render the whole analysis inapplicable to knowledge. For A can have good reasons to believe that P, even if P is false. And B can have good reasons to believe that A has good reasons to believe that P, again, even if P is false. However, this third condition is not my primary concern, for I would argue for a fallibilist conception of knowledge. That is, he's saying, even though we can never guarantee that our beliefs are true, we can still have knowledge if we have good enough reason to believe that our beliefs are true, and they happen to be true. At least one element of whether or not something is knowledge is going to be outside of our immediate ability to ascertain. But knowledge, he claims, is a real concept, and we are fallible beings, but we still have knowledge. We don't need an infallible method before we can say we have knowledge. I wish rather to focus our attention on the second, more neglected condition in the above analysis of A knows that P. It seems plausible that both A and B must have better or more complete reasons in order to know that P than are necessary merely to have good reasons to believe the P. For some beliefs, though rational, would not be well-founded enough to qualify as a knowledge, even on a fallibilist conception of knowledge. Thus, it seems reasonable to hold that there is a progression from 1. Believing the P, mere belief or right opinion, to 2. Having good reasons to believe the P, rational belief, to 3. Knowing the P. What happens then if we substitute know for has good reasons to believe in our formula? That is, B knows that A knows that P. Is it possible to know vicariously, as it were? Or must knowers, as opposed to mere rational believers, stand on their own epistemic feet? I argued above that B can have good reasons to believe the P without having direct reasons or evidence for P. Is the same true for knowing? Or must B know that P before he can know that A knows that P, thus precluding an appeal to A's knowledge as the basis and justification of his own claim to know? In other words, recalling the earlier distinction between having evidence that P and another kind of good reason to believe that P, must B possess the evidence for the truth of P in order to know that P? Or can knowledge, as well as rational belief, be based on an appeal to epistemic authority? Suppose someone tells me something that is true without giving me evidence for its truth. Perhaps A tells me that lay trial does not cure cancer without giving me the studies that prove this, much less the concrete data on which those studies are based. To make this more contemporarily relevant, imagine A tells me that ivermectin does not cure COVID without giving me any of the studies, much less the data that are in those studies. But suppose I have good reasons to believe that A is an authority in the field of cancer research, and so I believe what he tells me. Do I then know that lay trial does not cure cancer? Or have I achieved something much less than knowledge, perhaps only right belief or rational belief? If I then know, it is possible for one to know that P without possessing evidence for the truth of P. But that seems paradoxical or counterintuitive. For in the cases we are establishing, evidence is relevant to establishing knowledge. But we are asking whether it is possible to have this knowledge without having the relevant evidence. Even more paradoxical is the idea that B can know that P, even though he doesn't understand that P. Suppose an eminent authority in particle physics tells me that a quark is a fundamental particle, and suppose this is true. But I don't even understand what that means because I have no notion of what a quark is or what counts as a fundamental particle. However, I check up on the physicist, and as a result, I know that he has unsurpassed credentials. Could I then be said to know that a quark is a fundamental particle, though I don't even understand what I know? To sum up, should we say that B can, 1, know that P by knowing that A knows that P, and 2, know this without first knowing that P? Should we say this even if it implies that B can know that P without having evidence for P, and perhaps without even understanding P? Instead of attempting to answer these questions directly, I will argue that much of what we want to count as knowledge rests on the epistemic structure expressed by the formula. B knows that A knows that P. Footnote: this strategy for approaching these issues will mean, of course, that it remains open to a courageous enough epistemologist to avoid my conclusion by embracing the view that the achievements of scientists, researchers, and scholars are not and could not be knowledge whenever these achievements are based on cooperative methodologies. This option does not seem very attractive to me, to say the least. That is, he's going to argue, even the experts themselves know most of their things only on the basis of knowing that other people know them. I will then offer two conclusions and leave it to the reader to decide which is more epistemologically palatable. Scientists, researchers, and scholars are, sometimes at least, knowers. And all of these knowers stand on each other's shoulders in the way expressed by the formula. B knows that A knows that P. These knowers could not do their work without presupposing the validity of many other inquiries which they cannot, for reasons of competence as well as time, validate for themselves. Scientists, for example, simply do not repeat the experiments of other scientists unless the experiment is important and something seems fishy about it. It would, moreover, be impossible for anyone to get to the research front in, say, physics or psychology if he relied only on the results of his own inquiry or insisted on assessing for himself the evidence behind all the beliefs he accepts in his field. Thus, if scientists, researchers, and scholars are knowers, the layman-expert relationship is also present within the structure of knowledge. And the expert is an expert partially because he so often takes the role of the layman within his own field. That is, any expert on any subject matter whatsoever is going to be just trusting a lot of other experts for a lot of the beliefs that his own expertise is based on. Moreover, research in many fields is increasingly done by teams rather than individuals. For example, it is not uncommon for the title of an article reporting experimental results in particle physics to look like this. Here, look at this article. This is a page from Physical Review Letters in 1985, and he's showing us, here's an article with, I believe it's 99 co-authors. That may have been accurate in 1985. If you look at Physical Review Letters today, 99 is amateur stuff. I just looked at the most recent issue of Physical Review Letters, and I saw at least 3 articles that had over 200, maybe even 300 authors, and the cover page doesn't look like this. The cover page is just something that says, click here to see the list of authors. So yeah, they're not even trying to show you the list of authors. In the description, I'll link to a relatively recent article from maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where the list of our authors is actually longer than the article itself. William Bugg, professor of physics at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and a participant in this past experiment, explained how such an experiment is done. This experiment, which recorded charm events and measured the lifespan of the charmed particles. Who knows what that means? I don't. I know that it's a type of quark, but I only know that by trusting physicists. This experiment was one of a series of experiments costing perhaps $10 million. Again, those are 1985 dollars. In contemporary dollars, it's much larger, both because of inflation and because many of the experiments have gotten bigger. After it was funded, about 50 man-years were spent making the needed equipment and the necessary improvements in the Stanford Linear Accelerator. Then, approximately 50 physicists worked perhaps 50 man-years collecting the data for the experiment. When the data were in, the experimenters divided into 5 geographic groups to analyze the data, a process which involved looking at 2.5 million pictures, making measurements on 300,000 interesting events, and running the results through computers in order to isolate and measure 47 charm events. The West Coast group, that analyzed about 1/3 of the data, included 40 physicists and technicians who spent about 60 man-years on their analysis. Obviously, no one person could have done this experiment. In fact, Bugg reports that no one university or national laboratory could have done it. And many of the authors of an article like this will not even know how a given number in the article was arrived at. Footnote: of course, only a few people actually write the article, but it does not follow that these people are masterminds for the whole procedure, or that they completely understand the experiment and the analysis of the data. According to Bugg, although a few persons, the persons most actively involved in working on the data, who therefore understand most about it, wrote up the experiment. This article is about 3.5 journal pages long. They really only prepared a draft for revisions and corrections by the other authors. The team then met to argue substantive points about the techniques for analyzing the data and how the article should be presented to best enable other physicists to understand it. Furthermore, even if one person could know enough and live long enough to do such an experiment, notice that he mentioned at least 110 person-years of work just on the equipment, let alone looking through 2.5 million photos and so on. There would be absolutely no point in his attempting to do so, for his results would have become obsolete long before he completed the experiment. Although Bug expresses confidence that the team's measurement of the lifespan of charmed particles is a good one, he estimates that within 3 years, some other group will have come up with another technique that will give considerably better results. He consequently expects that within 5 years, the paper will no longer be of general interest. Finally, Bug notes that the article's 99 authors represent different specializations within particle physics, but all are experimentalists, so none would be able to undertake the theoretical revisions which might be required as a result of this experiment, and which provide a large part of the rationale for doing it. That is, say that their experiment discovered something about the lifespan of a charmed quark. Some theorist who's worked out the standard model of quantum mechanics may understand that, oh, if the lifespan of the charmed quark is this long, that actually changes how we have to think about how charmed quarks interact with top quarks or whatever. I don't know what's going on, but these experimentalists wouldn't know that either. However, they do know that the theorists can care about these things, and so they invest a lot of their own effort using their own expertise with equipment to figure out what they can about these particles, which then someone else is going to use for other purposes. On the other hand, most theoreticians would not be competent to conduct the experiment, and neither the experimentalists nor the theoreticians are competent to design, build, and maintain the equipment, without which the experiment could not be run at all. Obviously, this is an extreme example, though not all that extreme in the realm of particle physics. Of the 42 articles on elementary particles and fields published by Physical Review Letters in the 3 months from April 25 to July 18, 1983, 11 listed more than 10 authors, 9 listed more than 20 authors, and 5 more than 40 authors. In the same period, only 5 articles were by single authors. And notice, his numbers here are out of date. I just looked at the 2 most recent issues of Physical Review Letters, and as I said, in these 2 most recent issues, there were at least 5 articles that had over 100 authors. 4 of them were in particle physics, 1 was in another area, and out of the ones in particle physics, this was more than half of them were several hundred authors. And within particle physics, there were 4 or 5 other articles that had 3 to 7 authors, and 1 with 24 authors. The other areas of physics mostly had single-digit numbers of articles, but even out of the 40 or so articles in other areas of physics, only 1 of them had a single author. No, 2 of them had a single author in these most recent 2 issues. And so that's even in the areas that are less collaborative than particle physics, there's still more collaboration than he found in 1983 in particle physics. However, we can see how dependence on other experts pervades any complex field of research when we recognize that most footnotes that cite references are appeals to authority. And when these footnotes are used to establish premises for the study, they involve the author in layman-expert relationships even within his own pursuit of knowledge. Moreover, the horror that sweeps through the scientific community when a fraudulent researcher is uncovered is instructive, for what is at stake is not only public confidence. Rather, each researcher is forced to acknowledge the extent to which his own work rests on the work of others, work which he has not and could not, if only for reasons of time and expense, verify for himself. Thus, in very many cases within the pursuit of knowledge, there is clearly a complex network of appeals to the authority of various experts, and the resulting knowledge could not have been achieved by any one person. We then have something like the following. A knows that M, B knows that N, C knows that A knows that M, and that if M then O, D knows that B knows that N, and that C knows that O, and that if N and O then P, E knows that D knows that P. Suppose that this is the only way to know that P, and moreover, that no one who knows that P knows that M and O except by knowing that others know them. Does D or E know that P? Does anyone know that P? Is that P known? Unless we maintain that most of our scientific research and scholarship could never, because of the cooperative methodology of the expert enterprise, result in knowledge, I submit that we must say that P is known in cases like this. But If D or E knows that P, we must also say that someone can know vicariously, i.e., without possessing the evidence for the truth of what he knows, perhaps without even fully understanding what he knows. And this conclusion would require dramatic changes in our analysis of what knowledge must be. If the conclusion is unpalatable, another is possible. Perhaps that P is known not by any one person, but by the community composed of A, B, C, D, and E. Perhaps D and E are not entitled to say, I know that P, but only we know that P. This community is not reducible to a class of individuals, for no one individual and no one individually knows that P. If we take this tack, we could retain the idea that the knower must understand and have evidence for the truth of what he knows. But in doing so, we deny that the knower is always an individual, or even a class of individuals. This alternative may well point to part of what Peirce may have had in mind when he claimed that the community of inquirers is the primary knower and that individual knowledge is derivative. The latter conclusion may be the more epistemologically palatable, for it enables us to save the old and important idea that knowing a proposition requires understanding the proposition and possessing the relevant evidence for its truth. But it will not be very comfortable for those who have a taste for desert landscapes, intellectual autonomy, or epistemic individualism. Taste for desert landscapes is a reference to a famous paper by Willard Quine, who called On What There Is, where he tries to argue that many complex things don't really exist. It's just the individual sparser things. So he doesn't want to say that there are communities that know things in addition to individuals. So this conclusion that it's the community that knows things and no individual that does undermines the methodological individualism that is implicit in most epistemology. I believe that it is also deeply disturbing because it reveals the extent to which even our rationality rests on trust, and because it threatens some of our most cherished values: individual autonomy and responsibility, equality and democracy. But that is a story for another occasion. Thus, if the arguments of this paper are accepted, some very basic changes in our epistemologies are required. We must recast our conception of what it means for beliefs and persons to be rational. We must also either agree that one can know without possessing the supporting evidence, or accept the idea that there is knowledge that is known by the community, not by any individual knower. Okay, so you can justifiably believe something and maybe even know it without having the evidence yourself. You just have to be in a good position to know that someone has the evidence. Also, sometimes rationality requires you not to think for yourself. If you know there are good experts around, you should generally defer to them rather than trying to figure it out yourself. Maybe there's some amount of individual investigation that can be helpful in identifying the relevant experts. But if you find yourself in conflict with the experts, usually it'll be a better idea to trust the experts rather than yourself. And this suggests that knowledge is not an individual enterprise. Knowledge is a community enterprise because many of the biggest and most important things that anyone knows these days are only known because of the collaborative knowledge of many individuals, of many individual little facts that somehow then get put together to give us knowledge of the big facts that matter. And so epistemology is inherently going to involve a collective enterprise.